Hi, I'm Riley. My Aunt Constance looked me dead in the eye and said, "You get nothing. Not a penny, not a photograph, not even a memory from this house." Her lawyer nodded approvingly as she slid a document across the mahogany table. "Sign here to acknowledge you understand you have no claim to the Ashford estate." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just stared at the golden fountain pen she'd placed beside the paper and realized something they couldn't see. They had no idea what Uncle Theodore had really left behind, and they definitely didn't know I'd been keeping his secrets for 23 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They thought silence meant defeat, but silence was exactly how I'd learned to survive in this family. And today, it was about to make me $500 million richer. Before we dive in, what's the biggest lie someone in your family ever told you? Drop it in the comments because, trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. The Ashford family mansion smelled like old leather and fresh betrayal that Tuesday morning in October. I'd driven 4 hours from my tiny apartment in Millbrook to attend what I thought was Uncle Theodore's will reading. Instead, I walked into an execution. The dining room that once hosted warm Sunday dinners had been transformed into something cold and clinical. Aunt Constance sat at the head of the table like a queen dispensing justice, flanked by her twin sons Preston and Garrett, their wives Camille and Jade, perched on either side, looking like they'd already mentally redecorated the place. "Riley, sweetheart," Constance began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I know this is difficult, but Theodore was very clear about his wishes." She gestured to the lawyer, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Whitmore will explain everything." The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The deceased has left his entire estate, including Ashford Industries, the family properties, and all financial assets to be divided equally among his surviving siblings and their children." He paused, glancing at me. "However, there is a specific clause excluding Riley Ashford from any inheritance whatsoever." Preston leaned forward with a smirk. "Uncle Theodore felt you'd already received enough support over the years." Garrett nodded in agreement. "All those college payments, the car, helping with your mother's medical bills, he considered it an advance against any inheritance." I felt my chest tighten, not from hurt, but from the sheer audacity. Uncle Theodore had been the only family member who'd never made me feel like a charity case after my parents died in that car accident when I was 15. While Constance and her sons treated me like an obligation, Theodore had treated me like family. Real family. "I understand," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. "May I see the will?" Constance's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise. She probably expected tears, pleading, maybe even a dramatic scene. Instead, I sat there calmly, hands folded in my lap, watching her like I was studying for an exam. Whitmore slid a thick document across the table. I picked it up and began reading, taking my time with each page. The language was formal, legal, but clear enough. Theodore Ashford's estate, valued at approximately $8 million, would be distributed among his living relatives, except me. The exclusion clause was there in black and white, signed and notarized. What they didn't know was that I'd helped Uncle Theodore organize his papers just 6 months ago. What they didn't know was that he'd shown me his real safe, not the obvious one behind the painting in his study, but the hidden compartment in the basement workshop where he kept his most important documents. What they didn't know was that Uncle Theodore had been living a double life for decades, and the man they thought they were inheriting from barely scratched the surface of who he really was. "This seems very thorough," I said, closing the document. "Uncle Theodore always was meticulous about details." Camille shifted in her seat. "Well, that's settled then. Riley, you're welcome to take a few personal items if there's anything that has sentimental value." "How generous," I replied, not a trace of sarcasm in my voice. "Actually, there is one thing. Uncle Theodore promised me his old typewriter from the basement workshop. It's probably worthless, but it has meaning to me." The family exchanged glances. Preston waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, take the old junk. We're planning to clear out that whole basement anyway." I nodded gratefully, playing my part perfectly. Inside, I was calculating. The old typewriter was sitting right next to the wall safe they didn't know existed. The same safe that contained documents they'd never seen, including a will dated 3 weeks more recent than the one we'd just read. A will that told a very different story about Uncle Theodore's wishes, and more importantly, about the scope of his actual wealth. "Thank you all for being so understanding," I said slowly. "I know Uncle Theodore would have wanted the family to stick together during this difficult time." Constance actually smiled then, probably thinking she'd handled a potentially messy situation with grace. "Of course, dear. Family is everything." As I walked toward the door, I caught a glimpse of Preston and Garrett already discussing renovation plans for the mansion. Jade was taking pictures of the antique furniture with her phone, probably researching values. They were so confident, so sure they'd won, that none of them noticed the small silver key I palmed from Uncle Theodore's desk drawer as I passed by. The same key he'd pressed into my hand that last day I visited him in the hospital. The same key he'd whispered about with his final coherent words. "The real story is in the basement, Riley. When they think they know everything, show them they know nothing." I drove away from the mansion slowly, like someone defeated and processing grief. But in my rearview mirror, I could see Constance and her sons standing on the front steps, probably already planning how to spend their windfall. They looked so pleased with themselves, so certain they'd successfully pushed the poor, orphaned niece aside to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. What they didn't realize was that Theodore Ashford hadn't been a simple business owner with a modest fortune. What they didn't know was that the shy, quiet man who tinkered in his basement workshop had been quietly building an empire under shell companies and assumed names for 40 years. What they couldn't possibly imagine was that the real estate alone was worth more than they'd inherit in 10 lifetimes. As I turned onto the highway heading back toward Millbrook, I allowed myself one small smile. Tomorrow, I'd return to collect that worthless typewriter. And when I did, I'd finally open the safe that contained the truth about Uncle Theodore's $500 million secret. They told me I'd get nothing. They had no idea I was about to get everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The drive back to Millbrook gave me 4 hours to think. And thinking was something I'd learned to do very carefully around the Ashford family. You don't survive being the orphaned outsider in a family like that without developing some serious observational skills. But as I wound through the back roads of northern Colorado, my mind kept drifting to a conversation that happened 15 years ago, one that would change everything I thought I knew about Uncle Theodore. I was 23 then, fresh out of college with a degree in accounting that Uncle Theodore had quietly funded despite the family's protests. "She needs to learn to stand on her own," Aunt Constance had said. But Theodore never listened to Constance when it came to me. He'd pull me aside at family gatherings and slip me cash for textbooks, or mysteriously my tuition would be paid just when I thought I'd have to drop out. That particular Sunday, I'd driven up to help him organize his home office. The family always joked about Theodore being disorganized, scattered, the absent-minded inventor type who lived in his basement workshop. But when I got there, his study was immaculate. Every paper filed, every receipt categorized, financial statements organized by year and company. "Uncle Theodore," I said, looking around the pristine room, "the family thinks you're messy." He'd chuckled, a sound that always reminded me of my father. "Sometimes, Riley, the best way to hide something valuable is to let people think you're not worth watching." That's when he'd led me downstairs to his workshop for the first time. The basement everyone else saw was cluttered with half-finished inventions, old furniture, and what looked like decades of accumulated junk.
But Theodore walked straight to a workbench covered in ancient tools and pressed something hidden underneath. A section of the wall slid back, revealing a second room. "My God," I whispered. The hidden room was like stepping into a different world. Floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets lined every wall. Multiple computer monitors displayed what looked like stock portfolios and real estate holdings. A massive corkboard covered one entire wall, connected with colored string like something from a detective movie, tracking dozens of companies and investments. "Riley," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "I need you to understand something. The family sees what I let them see. A simple man with a small machine shop who tinkers in inventions. But I've been building something else entirely." He'd walked to one of the filing cabinets and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were incorporation papers, stock certificates, property deeds, all under names I'd never heard of. Meridian Holdings, Cascade Enterprises, Thornfield Industries. Page after page of companies, all connected, all showing Theodore as the principal owner. "I started this when your father and I were young. We had big dreams, wanted to build something that would last. After the accident," his voice caught slightly, "after we lost him and your mother, I kept building. For you." I stared at him, not understanding. "For me?"
Theodore had looked at me with tired eyes, because the moment Constance and her boys know what this is really worth, you'll never see a penny of it. They already resent what I've done for you. If they knew the real scope, he'd shaken his head. They'd find a way to tie it up in courts for years. Or worse, they'd make sure it never got to you at all. That afternoon, he'd walked me through everything. Showed me how the seemingly random companies were all connected, how legitimate business investments had been carefully structured to avoid family scrutiny. He'd even introduced me to his real lawyer, not Whitmore, who handled the family's simple affairs, but a woman named Sandra Reeves, who specialized in complex corporate structures and estate planning. "I've been documenting everything," he'd said, pulling out another folder thick with photographs, receipts, and notarized statements. "Every contribution I made to your education, every time the family made you feel like a burden, every comment about you not deserving family money, it's all here." "Why?" I'd asked, though part of me already knew. "Because when the time comes, they're going to try to justify cutting you out. They'll claim I've already given you enough, that you're not really family, that you don't deserve what they think belongs to them." His jaw had tightened, but they don't know what really belongs to whom. He'd made me promise that day to never tell anyone about the hidden room, about the real extent of his holdings, about any of it. "When I'm gone," he'd said, "let them think they've won. Let them celebrate their little inheritance. Then, when they're comfortable and complacent, show them what real family legacy looks like." Over the years that followed, I'd helped him maintain the fiction. I'd act grateful for small gifts while secretly helping him organize million-dollar deals. I'd listen to Constance and her sons talk about Theodore's failed business ventures when I knew he'd just sold another patent for 8 figures. I'd even attend family dinners where they'd make jokes about his messy basement, while I knew exactly what was hidden behind that false wall. The hardest part was watching him get sicker these past 2 years, watching the family act concerned while really just positioning themselves for his death. I'd sit by his hospital bed while Constance and her sons discussed funeral arrangements in the hallway, and Theodore would whisper updates about final legal preparations. "Sandra has everything ready," he told me just weeks before he died. "There are 2 wills, Riley. The one they'll see, and the one that matters. The real one is in the safe, along with documentation of everything. When they think they've pushed you aside, that's when you reveal who you really are." "Who am I, Uncle Theodore?" I asked, holding his frail hand. He'd smiled then, the same warm smile I remembered from childhood. You're your father's daughter, and your father and I built something that was always meant to be yours. Now, pulling into my apartment complex in Millbrook, I could almost hear his voice. Tomorrow, I would return to collect that typewriter. Tomorrow, I would open the safe that contained not just his real will, but documentation of a business empire worth $500 million. Tomorrow, I would stop being the grateful orphan niece and become what I'd always been meant to be, Theodore and my father's heir. But tonight, I would let Constance and her sons celebrate, let them plan their renovations and count their millions, because they had no idea that the modest inheritance they'd just claimed was nothing more than pocket change compared to what was really at stake. The poor little orphan girl was about to inherit an empire, and unlike them, I actually knew how to run one. I should have seen it coming the moment I walked into Uncle Theodore's funeral 3 weeks earlier. The service itself was beautiful. Theodore would have loved the simplicity, the genuine stories people shared about his kindness and generosity. But afterward, during the reception at the mansion, I started noticing things. Small things at first. The way Constance kept steering conversations away from Theodore's business ventures whenever anyone asked. How Preston and Garrett positioned themselves near every group discussing Theodore's legacy, always ready to redirect or clarify. How Jade kept taking notes on her phone whenever someone mentioned property or investments. I remember standing near the dessert table listening to Mrs. Henderson from Theodore's neighborhood talk about how generous he'd been, always helping with her property taxes when things got tight. Constance appeared beside us like smoke, all sympathy and gentle interruption. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson, you're so sweet to remember Theodore's little gestures. He did love to help where he could, though. I'm afraid his resources were quite limited these past few years. The business hadn't been doing well, you know?" Mrs. Henderson had looked confused. Limited? But just last month, he paid for my new roof after that storm damage. Said it was no trouble at all. I watched Constance's smile tighten almost imperceptibly. How thoughtful of him to help however he could manage. Theodore always had such a big heart, even when it might have been wiser to be more conservative with his finances. The implication hung in the air like incense. Theodore was financially reckless, generous to a fault, probably left the family in a difficult position. I'd seen Constance plant these seeds my entire adult life, always positioning herself as the reasonable one, the one who had to clean up other people's messes.
Later that same afternoon, I overheard Preston talking to Theodore's longtime business partner, Frank Delacroix, near the garden entrance. "It's a real shame about Uncle Theodore's company," Preston was saying, shaking his head sadly. "I know he tried to keep it going, but these last few years—" Frank frowned. Keep what going? Theodore's investments were doing better than ever. Just last quarter, he told me about some major returns from his tech portfolio. "Oh, Frank," Preston laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "You know how Uncle Theodore was. Always optimistic, always talking big. The reality is that machine shop of his was bleeding money. We're going to have to sell it just to cover his debts." I watched Frank's face change from confusion to something approaching alarm. Debts? What debts? Theodore showed me his financial statements just 6 months ago. The man was sitting on more liquid assets than most people see in a lifetime. Preston's expression shifted slightly, and for just a moment, I saw calculation behind his grief mask. "I think you might be misunderstanding something, Frank. Maybe Theodore was optimistic about his projections. You know how small business owners can be about their books." That's when I realized they weren't just planning to cut me out of the inheritance. They were actively rewriting Theodore's entire financial history. creating a narrative where he'd been struggling, where the family would be lucky to inherit anything substantial, where generous gestures to neighbors and nieces had been irresponsible rather than evidence of his actual wealth. The week following the funeral, the phone calls started. First, it was Camille, Theodore's nephew's wife, calling to check in and see how I was handling the grief. "I know Uncle Theodore was special to you. He always had such a soft spot for you. Maybe too soft, if I'm being honest." "What do you mean?" I'd asked, though I already knew where this was heading. "Well, all that money he spent on your education, helping with your mother's medical bills, that car he bought you. Don't get me wrong, it was sweet, but it probably wasn't the most responsible thing for someone in his financial position." There it was, the setup, making sure I understood that any inheritance I might have expected had already been given to me over the years, that Theodore had been financially irresponsible in helping me, and now the family would have to deal with the consequences. "I never asked him for help," I'd said quietly. "Of course not, honey. That's not what I'm saying. It's just, well, when someone's resources are limited, every dollar matters, you know? I'm sure when we settle the estate, the family will find a way to help you if you need anything." The condescension was breathtaking. They were already positioning themselves as my potential benefactors, graciously offering to help the poor niece who'd already received more than her fair share from their beloved but financially reckless uncle. 2 days later, Garrett called with a different approach, more direct, less sugarcoating. "Riley, I wanted to talk to you about Uncle Theodore's estate before things get complicated." "Complicated how?" "Well, there are debts. More than we initially realized. The family might need to make some difficult decisions about liquidating assets to cover what he owed." I almost laughed. Theodore's debts consisted of a small business loan he had taken out specifically to maintain his cover story, and monthly payments on equipment he could have bought outright with pocket change. But I played along. "That sounds serious. What kind of debts?" "Business loans, mostly. Some equipment financing. Look, the point is, whatever Theodore might have promised you over the years, the reality is there might not be much left after we settle his obligations." The beautiful thing about having spent 15 years learning Theodore's real business practices was that I knew exactly what Garrett was doing. He was following a playbook: create financial urgency, establish family hardship, position any inheritance as a generous gesture rather than a legal right. "I understand," I said. I could almost hear his relief through the phone. That's really mature of you, Riley. I know the family appreciates your understanding." But the most telling conversation happened with Constance herself, just 4 days before the will reading. She'd invited me to lunch at her country club, all warm smiles and concerned aunt energy. "Riley, sweetheart, I wanted to prepare you for some potentially disappointing news." We were sitting on the club's terrace, surrounded by women who lunched and men who golfed, the kind of environment where Constance felt most in control. She'd chosen her territory carefully. "Theodore's final affairs are messy," she'd continued, cutting her salmon with surgical precision. "He was never very good with money, always helping everyone else before taking care of his own security." "He seemed comfortable enough," I'd said mildly. "Oh, appearances can be deceiving. That old house needs so much work. The business has been struggling for years, and there are some significant debts we're still discovering." She paused to sip her white wine, watching me over the rim of her glass like a hawk studying prey. "The thing is, dear, I know Theodore made certain promises to you over the years about taking care of you, about making sure you were provided for.
And I want you to know that the family intends to honor his intentions, even if his estate can't. There it was again, the reframing. Theodore's promises weren't legal commitments. They were intentions that the family might graciously fulfill if they felt like it. "What are you saying exactly?" I asked.
I'm saying that regardless of what any legal documents might or might not say, you'll always be family to us. We'll make sure you're taken care of. The threat was so subtle, it was almost artistic. She was telling me that my legal standing was irrelevant, that my inheritance was dependent on family goodwill, and that challenging them would mean losing even their minimal support. I'd nodded and smiled and thanked her for her concern. Inside, I was marveling at the sophistication of their strategy. They'd spent 3 weeks laying groundwork, establishing a narrative, creating witnesses to Theodore's supposed financial struggles and their own generous intentions toward the poor, orphaned niece. What they didn't know was that every phone call, every subtle threat, every attempt to rewrite history was just confirming what Theodore had predicted. They weren't just planning to cut me out. They were planning to make it look justified, even generous. That night, I'd pulled out the folder Theodore had given me years ago, the one documenting every slight, every dismissive comment, every time the family had made me feel like a burden rather than a member. I'd added my own notes from the past 3 weeks, dates, times, exact quotes from their phone calls and conversations. Theodore had been right about something else, too. The moment they thought they controlled the narrative, they'd gotten careless. They'd revealed their strategy, their timeline, their entire approach to cutting me out while maintaining their reputation as the reasonable, generous family members. Tomorrow, they'd present their carefully crafted story to the lawyer and expect me to accept it gracefully. They'd watch me sign away any claims to Theodore's estate and probably feel genuinely proud of how smoothly they'd handled a potentially messy situation. They had no idea that every word they'd spoken, every subtle manipulation they'd employed was about to become evidence in a case that would redefine everything they thought they knew about Theodore Ashford's legacy. But first, I had to let them think their plan had worked perfectly. The week after the will reading, I expected silence. Maybe a polite check-in call or two, then everyone would move on with their newly inherited lives. Instead, what I got was a masterclass in systematic control that would have impressed even Theodore with its thoroughness. It started with the house keys. Wednesday morning, I was making coffee in my tiny Millbrook kitchen when my phone rang. Constance, of course, her voice bright with false energy. "Riley, darling, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to let you know we're having the locks changed at the mansion today." I paused, mug halfway to my lips. "The locks?" "Just a security precaution. You understand. With Theodore gone, we need to make sure everything is properly secured. I'm sure you still have your key from all the times you helped him with organizing. And while we trust you completely, our insurance requires us to account for all access." The message was clear. Return your key. You're not welcome anymore. But she'd wrapped it in concern and policy requirements, making it sound like a reasonable business decision rather than what it actually was, cutting off my access to the house before I could retrieve anything they didn't want me to have. "Of course," I said. "I can have it by later today." "Oh, that's not necessary. Preston's actually in Millbrook this morning for work. He could swing by and pick it up. Save you the drive." Preston was in Millbrook, my quiet little town where nothing ever happened, where I'd specifically chosen to live because none of the Ashfords ever visited. The coincidence felt deliberate. "That works," I agreed. "I'll be home around noon."
Preston arrived at 11:47, precisely calculated to catch me off guard but not seem overeager. He looked around my small apartment with the same expression you might use for a crime scene. Not disgusted exactly, but filing out details for later judgment. "Cozy place," he said, accepting the key I offered. "Very efficient." "It suits me." He pocketed the key but didn't leave, instead wandering toward my small home office where my computer sat open to what appeared to be job search websites. I'd set that up deliberately, knowing someone from the family would eventually come sniffing around. "Still looking for work?" he asked, feigning casual interest. "Between jobs right now. The accounting firm downsized last month." Another carefully constructed lie. I'd actually been freelancing successfully for 3 years, but letting them think I was financially vulnerable seemed wise. "That's rough. The market's tough right now. You know, Garrett mentioned they might need some bookkeeping help at the company. Nothing fancy, but it could tide you over." And there it was, the first offer of dependence disguised as generosity. "Take our charity job, become our employee, give us leverage over your income and therefore your independence." "That's kind of him to think of me," I said neutrally. "I could put in a good word. Family should help family, right? Especially now that things are settled with Uncle Theodore's estate." The word "settled" hung between us like a signed contract. We both understand where things stand now. You have nothing, we have everything. This is the new normal. After he left, I sat in my quiet apartment thinking about patterns. Theodore had taught me to recognize them in business, when competitors were trying to squeeze you out, when partners were planning to restructure deals or clients were preparing to terminate contracts. The signs were always there if you knew how to look.
Thursday brought Jade's call, perfectly timed for maximum impact. "Riley, how are you holding up, sweetie?" Her voice had that particular quality of someone performing concern for an audience, even though we were alone on the phone. "I'm fine, thanks." "Good, good. Listen, I was going through some of Theodore's things, just sorting what to keep, what to donate, and I found a few items that might have sentimental value for you." My pulse quickened, despite my efforts to stay calm. "What kind of items?" "Oh, just some photos. Maybe that old cookbook he used to make those terrible pancakes." She laughed, like we were sharing a fond memory, though I couldn't recall Jade ever eating Theodore's pancakes or spending enough time with him to have cooking memories. "Nothing valuable, you understand, but I know how you treasure those little keepsakes." Little keepsakes. She was letting me know that anything truly valuable had already been identified and claimed. I was being offered crumbs and expected to be grateful. "That's thoughtful of you." The thing is, we're moving pretty quickly with clearing things out. The house needs work, and we've got contractors coming Monday to start renovations. If you want these items, you'd need to pick them up this weekend. Say, Saturday afternoon? Saturday afternoon, during prime weekend renovation planning time, when the whole family would likely be at the house discussing changes, making decisions, asserting ownership. She wanted me to see them in possession, making choices about Theodore's home without consulting me. "Saturday works." "Perfect. Oh, and Riley, you might want to say goodbye to the house properly. I know it holds a lot of memories for you. This will probably be your last chance to see it the way Theodore left it." The threat couldn't have been clearer if she'd put it in writing. "Come Saturday, see what you've lost, accept that it's gone forever, and do it while we watch." Friday morning brought the most sophisticated manipulation yet. Camille appeared at my apartment door unannounced, carrying coffee and pastries from an expensive bakery in Denver. "Surprise! I thought you might need some cheering up." I let her in, mainly because I was curious about what approach she'd take.
Camille had always been the subtlest of the family manipulators, preferring psychological pressure to direct confrontation. She settled onto my small couch like she was visiting a sick relative, all gentle concern and careful attention. The pastries remained untouched between us, props in whatever scene she was staging. "I've been thinking about you constantly, Riley. This whole situation with Theodore's estate, I know it must be difficult. I'm managing." "Are you, though? Really?" She leaned forward slightly. "Riley, can I speak honestly with you?" This was it, the moment she'd been building toward. "Of course. I'm worried about you, not just financially, though obviously that's a concern too, but emotionally. You've been so isolated lately. When's the last time you talked to anyone outside of work?" The question caught me off guard, mainly because it revealed how closely they'd been monitoring my social media, and probably my activities. I kept my personal life deliberately quiet, but they'd apparently noticed. "I have friends." "Do you? When's the last time you went out, had dinner with someone, dated?" She asked these questions like a concerned therapist, not a family member who'd barely spoken to me in years before this week. "My social life is fine." "Is it, though? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been living in this little bubble, working jobs that don't challenge you, living in a place where you don't know anyone, cutting yourself off from people who care about you." There it was, the reframe. My independence wasn't strength, it was isolation. My self-sufficiency wasn't admirable, it was sad. My quiet life wasn't peaceful, it was empty. "The family cares about you, Riley. We always have. But it's hard to help someone who won't let you get close." She was rewriting our entire history. All those years of condescending comments, dismissive remarks, being treated like an obligation rather than a person, none of that had happened. Instead, I'd been the one keeping distance, refusing their generous offers of connection. Maybe this whole situation with Theodore's estate is actually an opportunity, a chance to rebuild relationships, to let people in. "What do you mean?" "Well, Garrett's bookkeeping offer, for instance. It's not just about work. It would give you a reason to be around family more. And there's a small apartment above the office that's not being used. You could save money on rent, be closer to people who care about you." The apartment above the office, where they could monitor my comings and goings, control my living situation, make my housing dependent on my employment, which was dependent on their goodwill. It was brilliant, really. "That's generous of you, but I like my independence." Camille's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of something harder beneath the concern. "Independence is wonderful, Riley, but it can become isolation if you're not careful. And isolation can lead to poor decisions." Poor decisions. Like challenging their version of Theodore's estate, like refusing their offers of help, like maintaining boundaries they wanted me to cross. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully. "Good. That's all any of us want, for you to know you're not alone." She stood, leaving the pastries untouched. "Think about Garrett's offer, okay? Sometimes accepting help is the strongest thing you can do."
After she left, I made a list of everything that had happened since the will reading. The lock change with exactly 8 hours' notice, Preston's job offer coupled with casual assessment of my financial situation, Jade's deadline for retrieving keepsakes designed to coincide with maximum family presence, Camille's psychological evaluation disguised as friendship. It was textbook isolation strategy. Cut off access to the target location, create financial pressure, establish artificial deadlines, offer solutions that increase dependence, and frame independence as character flaw requiring intervention. What made it particularly insidious was how caring it all appeared on the surface. Anyone overhearing these conversations would think the Ashford family was going above and beyond to help their struggling niece through a difficult time. The manipulation was so subtle, so wrapped in concern and generosity, that refusing their help made me look ungrateful or even mentally unstable. That night, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Sandra Reeves' number, Theodore's real lawyer, the one who'd helped structure his actual holdings, the one the family had never met. I didn't call her, not yet, but I saved her number to my favorites and started drafting a message that began with 4 simple words. It's time to proceed. Tomorrow, I would go to the mansion, collect my keepsakes, and play the grateful defeated niece one last time. I would let them see exactly what they expected to see. Someone isolated, financially vulnerable, and dependent on their goodwill. What they wouldn't see was someone who'd spent the last 4 days documenting their every manipulation tactic for use in the legal proceedings that would begin Monday morning. Theodore always said timing was everything in business. The family thought they were controlling the timeline, setting the pace, managing the process. They had no idea I was about to change the entire game. Saturday afternoon at the mansion felt like walking into a carefully choreographed performance. I arrived at exactly 2 p.m. as requested and found the entire family assembled like they were expecting a photographer. Constance stood in the foyer wearing pearls and an expression of benevolent sadness. Preston and Garrett flanked the main staircase in matching polo shirts, looking like security guards disguised as golf partners. Their wives sat in the living room, surrounded by photo albums and tissue boxes, playing the role of grieving family members sorting through precious memories. "Riley, sweetheart," Constance rushed forward with a hug that felt like being embraced by a mannequin. "I'm so glad you could make it. We've put aside some lovely items we thought you'd treasure." On the coffee table sat a small cardboard box, about the size that might hold a pair of shoes. Inside were exactly the items Jade had mentioned: a handful of photographs, Theodore's old cookbook with the loose binding, and a few trinkets that looked like they'd been pulled from junk drawers, the kind of things you'd give to a housekeeper's daughter when clearing an estate. But it was what I saw behind the staged morning scene that made my blood run cold. Contractors' business cards were scattered across Theodore's desk, paint samples were taped to the walls, measuring tape and notebooks covered the dining room table where we'd held the will reading just days ago. They weren't planning renovations. They were planning complete transformation. "We're thinking of opening up this wall," Camille was explaining to someone on speakerphone, gesturing toward the wall that separated Theodore's study from the living room. "Create more of an open concept feel." That wall, the one that backed up to Theodore's basement workshop, the one that would require structural evaluation, which would inevitably lead to discovery of the hidden room below. "And the basement," Garrett added, consulting a legal pad covered in notes. "Complete gut renovation. Turn it into a proper rec room, maybe a home theater." I kept my expression neutral, even grateful, as I examined the items they'd selected for me. But inside, I was calculating rapidly. They weren't just claiming Theodore's estate. They were planning to destroy any evidence that their version of his financial situation had been fabricated. This cookbook was always my favorite. Theodore made the best pancakes from this recipe. "Oh, yes," Jade smiled. "Such sweet memories." Except Theodore never made pancakes from that cookbook. He'd been diabetic for 15 years and couldn't eat them. The cookbook had belonged to my grandmother, and Theodore had kept it purely for sentimental reasons. Jade's lie was casual, automatic, designed to reinforce the fiction that she'd been close enough to Theodore to have cooking memories with him. "The contractors start Monday," Preston announced, apparently unable to contain his enthusiasm. "We're hoping to have the whole place updated within 6 months." That's ambitious. "Well, it needs so much work. The foundation has some issues, the electrical is ancient, and that basement. Shake his head. Complete disaster. Decades of accumulated junk. We're just gonna clear everything out, start fresh." Start fresh. Eliminate any trace of Theodore's real activities, real holdings, real relationships.
Create a clean slate where their version of events would be the only one left standing.
The list made my hands shake. Workshop equipment, scrap metal value only. Filing cabinets, shred all contents. Old computer equipment, data wipe and disposal. Wall safe behind painting, empty, remove. They'd found Theodore's obvious safe, the one he'd kept deliberately empty except for a few $100s in cash and some old family photos. But more telling was what came next on the list. Basement structural assessment before demo. Check for utilities, pipes, foundation issues. A structural assessment would reveal the hidden room. They weren't planning to discover it accidentally during renovation. They were planning to find it, explore it, and then claim whatever they found as part of Theodore's hidden debts or discovered assets that somehow validated their version of events. "Riley?" Constance's voice called from the foyer. "Everything all right, dear?" "Just saying goodbye to the study," I called back, quickly pocketing my phone. So many memories here. When I returned to the living room, the family had arranged themselves in a semicircle around the coffee table, like an intervention waiting to happen. The box of keepsakes sat in the center like evidence in a trial. "We wanted to talk to you about something," Constance began, her tone shifting to serious family business. "Garrett mentioned he offered you some bookkeeping work." "He did. That was kind of him. The thing is, Riley, we've been talking, and we're concerned about you living so far away, especially with your employment situation being uncertain." Here it was, the coordinated push I'd been expecting. "The apartment above the office," Preston continued. "It's actually quite nice. Fully furnished, utilities included. You'd essentially be living rent-free while you get back on your feet. And being closer to family during this difficult time, grief can be so isolating. The work itself is straightforward. Receivables, payables, basic bookkeeping. Nothing too challenging, but steady income while you figure out your next steps." They were offering me exactly what I'd expected: dependence disguised as opportunity, control disguised as care, isolation disguised as family closeness. What I hadn't expected was how quickly they wanted to implement it. "We could have you moved in by next weekend," Camille offered. "I know some reliable movers. It wouldn't cost you anything." Next weekend. Before the basement renovation began, before any structural assessments that might reveal inconvenient truths. They wanted me physically relocated, financially dependent, and socially isolated before they started destroying evidence. "That's incredibly generous," I said slowly. "But could I have some time to think about it?" "Of course," Constance smiled, but I caught the quick glance she exchanged with Preston. "Though the apartment won't stay available indefinitely, good opportunities tend to move quickly." Artificial scarcity. Another classic manipulation tactic: create urgency around their offer to prevent me from having time to consider alternatives or seek outside advice. "How long do you think you'd need? Just so we can plan appropriately." "Maybe a week?" "A week?" Preston repeated like he was filing the deadline away. "That should work. The contractors don't start the major demo until next Friday, anyway." Demo until next Friday. They'd given me exactly 1 week to accept their job offer and move into their controlled housing before they began destroying Theodore's workshop and any evidence it contained. As I left the mansion with my box of carefully curated keepsakes, I realized the scope of what they'd planned. This wasn't just about inheritance fraud. It was about eliminating any possibility that their version of events could ever be challenged. By next Friday, Theodore's basement workshop would be gone. Any filing cabinets, computer equipment, or documentation that contradicted their narrative would be destroyed. I would either be living in their apartment, working their job, and dependent on their goodwill, or I would be completely cut off from any resources to challenge them. The timeline was brilliant in its efficiency. 1 week to either accept their control or lose any chance of proving they were wrong about Theodore's estate. What they didn't know was that I'd already made my decision the moment I saw Garrett's handwritten list. That evening, I finally made the call I'd been preparing for. "Sandra Reeves' office?"
This is Riley Ashford. I need to schedule an emergency meeting with Ms. Reeves about the Theodore Ashford estate. How's Monday morning at 9? Perfect. And Sandra, tell her to bring everything. All of it. It's time. Sunday night, I sat in my small apartment surrounded by banker's boxes I'd retrieved from my storage unit. Inside were 15 years of documentation Theodore had insisted I maintain. Every family gathering where dismissive comments were made, every financial gift that had been reframed as excessive generosity, every interaction that revealed the family's true attitude toward my place in their hierarchy.
But more importantly, the boxes contained copies of documents the family had no idea existed. Theodore had been meticulous about creating backup records of his real business activities, and he'd made sure I had access to copies of everything: incorporation papers, financial statements, property deeds, investment records, even recorded phone conversations with business partners that referenced his actual net worth. Tomorrow, Sandra and I would begin the process of revealing what Theodore had really built, what he'd really left behind, and who he'd really intended to inherit it. The family had given me 1 week to accept their control or lose everything. They had no idea that I was about to show them what losing everything actually looked like. Sandra Reeves' office was nothing like the mahogany paneled chambers where most estate lawyers conducted business. Her space was all glass and steel, with computer monitors displaying real-time market data and walls lined with filing cabinets secured by electronic locks. This was where serious money got managed, not where grieving families sorted through sentimental possessions. "Riley," she stood as I entered, extending a firm handshake. "I wondered when you'd call. Theodore said you'd know the right time." She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. On her desk were 3 thick folders, each labeled with my name in Theodore's distinctive handwriting. "He prepared for this moment very carefully," she continued, gesturing for me to sit, "down to predicting almost exactly when you'd need to activate the real estate plan." "The real estate plan?" Sandra opened the first folder and slid a document across the desk. "Theodore was convinced his family would try to cut you out using a fabricated will. He also predicted they'd attempt to manipulate you into accepting their version of events through financial pressure and social isolation." The document was a detailed psychological profile of each family member, complete with predicted behavior patterns and manipulation tactics. Reading it was like watching Theodore's ghost predict the future with uncanny accuracy. "Constance will frame financial independence as selfishness. Preston will offer employment that creates dependence. Garrett will establish artificial deadlines to prevent careful consideration of alternatives." Every single prediction had come true. How did he know? I asked. Because he'd been watching them maneuver for position for decades. Every Christmas dinner, every family gathering, every business decision. He was documenting their reactions, their priorities, their methods. Sandra opened the second folder. Inside were photographs from family events spanning 20 years. But these weren't the usual happy gathering snapshots. Theodore had captured moments of whispered conversations, dismissive gestures, calculating expressions when they thought no one was looking. Each photo was dated and annotated with context notes. "Preston discussing your college fund, December 2019. Why should family money go to someone who isn't really family?" Constance talking about Theodore's estate, Easter 2022. "When he's gone, we'll finally be able to manage things properly." Garrett and Jade planning renovations, Thanksgiving 2023. "That old house is worth more as development land than as family property." 20 years of evidence that their current behavior wasn't grief-driven poor judgment. It was the culmination of long-term planning. "They've been plotting this for decades," I said, staring at the photos. Theodore knew, and he spent those same decades planning his response. Sandra opened the third folder, the thickest one. The real Theodore Ashford estate is structured across 43 separate legal entities, 12 different states, and 5 offshore jurisdictions. The family's $8 million inheritance represents approximately 1.6% of his actual holdings.
She spread out a network diagram that looked like a family tree designed by accountants. Lines connected boxes representing companies, trusts, partnerships, and holdings, all ultimately flowing back to a central entity labeled Thornfield Trust, primary beneficiary, Riley Ashford. $512 million. That's the current estimated value of what Theodore actually left you. And that's conservative. Some of the tech investments alone are worth more than the family thinks the entire estate is worth. I stared at the numbers, trying to process them. $500 million, not $8 million, not $80 million, but an amount that would fundamentally change not just my life, but potentially entire industries if deployed strategically. Why hide it this way? Why not just leave me everything openly? Because Theodore knew they'd contest a will that left you everything and them nothing. They'd tie it up in courts for years, claim undue influence, argue you manipulated him, maybe even suggest cognitive decline. Sandra pulled out another document. This way, they get enough to satisfy their immediate greed and feel successful, while you get what was always intended to be yours. But they're planning to destroy the evidence, the basement renovation, clearing out his workshop. Let them. Sandra smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. Everything they're planning to destroy consists of carefully planted decoy documents. The real records have been in secure storage for 15 years. She handed me a small electronic device, about the size of a car key fob. This accesses a safety deposit box at Denver Merchant Bank. Inside are the originals of every document they think they're going to eliminate, plus about 6 additional boxes of materials they have no idea exist.
Theodore had been thinking 10 moves ahead, while his family was still learning the rules of the game. What about the timeline? They want me to accept their job offer by Friday, and then they start demolition. Perfect. We'll let them follow their plan exactly. Meanwhile, we'll be filing the necessary paperwork to assume control of Theodore's actual holdings. Sandra consulted her calendar. I can have the primary trust activation completed by Wednesday. The subsidiary asset transfers should be finished by Friday morning. What happens then? Then you walk into their deadline meeting as the legal owner of approximately 90% of everything they think they're inheriting. Sandra spent the next hour walking me through the structure Theodore had created. It was elegant in its complexity, each layer designed to be legally bulletproof while remaining invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. The machine shop that Preston and Garrett planned to sell for scrap metal, it was actually the headquarters of a precision manufacturing company that held exclusive patents on components used in aerospace engineering. The property they thought was worth maybe $2 million, it included mineral rights that were currently being developed by 3 separate mining companies. Even the house itself wasn't what it seemed. Theodore hadn't just owned the mansion, he'd quietly purchased every adjacent property over the past 20 years, creating a 100-acre estate that the city of Ashford had already approved for commercial development. They're planning to renovate a house that sits on what will become the largest mixed-use development project in the county's history, Sandra explained. Ground breaks in 18 months. Does the family know about the development project? They applied for the permits. I stared at her. What? Garrett's construction company submitted the development proposal 2 years ago. They have no idea they're planning to bulldoze their own potential inheritance to build on land that already belongs to you. The irony was breathtaking. They were literally destroying their own fortune while trying to steal mine. The beauty of Theodore's structure, Sandra continued, is that every action they take to secure their position actually strengthens yours. The more aggressively they move to claim assets, the more evidence they create of their intent to defraud the rightful heir. She showed me recordings from the mansion's security system, cameras Theodore had installed years ago that the family had never known about. Every conversation about renovations, every discussion of my financial situation, every calculation about how to manipulate me into accepting their control was documented in high-definition audio and video. Garrett's list of priority removal items, Sandra said, pulling up a clear image on her computer screen. He wrote that in Theodore's study
30 feet away from a camera that's been recording every family meeting for 5 years. They incriminated themselves, repeatedly and thoroughly. Theodore always said the guilty convict themselves if you just give them enough rope. The final folder contained my new identity documents, not fake papers, but legal recognition of my actual inheritance position. Business cards identifying me as Director of Holdings for the Thornfield Trust, banking credentials for accounts I'd never known existed, corporate authorization giving me signatory power over companies I'd never heard of. As of tomorrow morning, you will be one of the largest individual landowners in Colorado, a major shareholder in 16 publicly traded companies, and the primary investor in a development project that will reshape your hometown. What do I do with all of this? Whatever Theodore taught you to do. Make decisions that honor the legacy he built, take care of people who deserve it, and ensure that wealth creates more good than harm. She handed me one final document, a handwritten letter in Theodore's familiar script. He asked me to give you this after everything was explained. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Riley, if you're reading this, it means they showed their true nature exactly as I predicted. You now hold the power to either destroy them completely or give them a chance to prove they're better than their worst instincts. The choice is yours, and whatever you decide will be the right decision because you understand something they never learned. Real wealth isn't what you take, it's what you give. Build something worthy of your father's memory. Theodore. Looking up at Sandra, I felt the weight of possibility settling on my shoulders. Not the burden of responsibility, but the lightness that comes from finally understanding your actual position in the world. When do we tell them? We don't tell them anything. On Friday, when they expect you to accept their job offer and move into their apartment, you'll simply inform them that your circumstances have changed. And then? Well, then you watch them realize that the orphaned niece they've been manipulating for 20 years just became the most powerful person in their lives. I left Sandra's office carrying a briefcase containing enough legal documentation to rewrite the entire family's future. But more importantly, I carried the knowledge that Theodore's faith in me had been justified, and that the patient, quiet girl who'd watched and listened for so many years was finally ready to speak. Wednesday morning, I woke up as the legal owner of $500 million in assets. The paperwork Sandra had filed the previous day was processed with the kind of efficiency that only happens when lawyers charge $800 an hour and judges recognize ironclad documentation. By 9 a.m., I had controlling interest in companies I'd never heard of and voting rights on boards I'd never imagined joining.
The first sign that the family's world was about to shift came at 10:17 a.m. when Garrett's construction company received a call from the county planning office. I wasn't there to witness it directly, but Sandra had arranged for a court reporter to document the conversation. The county needed to discuss certain complications with the Ashford property development proposal that required immediate attention from the project's primary stakeholder. The primary stakeholder. Not the Ashford family, not the estate, not even Theodore's heirs. Me. Personally. According to the transcript Sandra showed me later, Garrett's response was exactly what we'd predicted. There must be some mistake. The Ashford family owns that property. Sir, according to our records, the property is owned by Thornfield Trust, with Riley Ashford as the primary beneficiary and decision-maker. We'll need her authorization to proceed with any development plans. 37 minutes later, my phone started ringing. I let it go to voicemail. Then I let the next 6 calls go to voicemail. By noon, I had 14 messages from various family members, each one more urgent and confused than the last. Riley, it's Preston. Call me back immediately. There's some kind of administrative error with the property records. Riley, this is Constance. I'm sure this is just paperwork confusion, but we need to get it sorted out today. Riley, Garrett here. The county is saying crazy things about property ownership. We need to meet this afternoon. I saved every message, then forwarded them to Sandra for the official record. Each call was more evidence of their assumption that any legal complications were simply obstacles to be managed, not revelations of actual ownership.
That afternoon, while they were frantically trying to reach me, I was sitting in the boardroom of Meridian Holdings, Theodore's primary investment company, being introduced to the executive team I now controlled. Ms. Ashford, the CFO, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Morrison, slid a portfolio across the conference table. Your uncle spoke of you often. We're honored to finally meet Theodore's chosen successor. Chosen successor. Not heir, not beneficiary, but successor. These people had been expecting me for years. Theodore was very specific about the transition timeline, Morrison continued. He predicted almost exactly when you'd need to assume control, and he prepared us accordingly. The portfolio contained summaries of companies I now had decision-making power over: an aerospace components manufacturer, 3 renewable energy companies, a chain of specialty medical device producers, and something called Aurora Technologies that apparently held patents on battery storage systems used by major automotive companies. Our current annual revenue across all holdings is approximately $87 million. Net profits last year were $31 million, most of which has been reinvested according to Theodore's long-term growth strategy. $31 million in annual profits. The family was fighting over an $8 million inheritance, while I'd just discovered I owned companies that generated nearly 4 times that every single year. What about the Ashford property development? I asked. Morrison smiled. That's one of Theodore's more elegant long-term plays. The property is currently zoned residential, but the development permits will change that to mixed-use commercial. Once approved, the land value will increase by approximately 340%. And the family doesn't know? Theodore was very clear that they should remain unaware of the property's true potential until you decided how to handle the situation. At 4 p.m., while I was reviewing quarterly reports from companies I'd inherited, Sandra called with an update. The family has requested an emergency meeting with their lawyer. Apparently, they're convinced there's been some kind of clerical error with the county records. What did their lawyer tell them? That he'd look into it. What he actually did was call me to ask what the hell was going on. I explained that his clients had been operating under some significant misunderstandings about their uncle's estate. How did he react? Professional curiosity mixed with mounting concern. He's smart enough to realize his clients may have made some very expensive assumptions. That evening, I finally returned one call. Constance, of course, because she'd left the most messages and her tone had evolved from confused to demanding over the course of the day. Riley, thank God, we've been trying to reach you all day. I was in meetings. What's going on? There's some kind of confusion with the county about property ownership. They're saying you have some claim on the family land, which obviously doesn't make sense given the will reading. The careful way she said some claim was telling. She wasn't denying my ownership outright. She was testing to see how much I knew. That is strange. I agreed. What did your lawyer say? He's looking into it, but Riley, we need to meet tomorrow to straighten this out. The contractors are supposed to start Friday, and we can't have administrative delays holding up the renovation. Administrative delays. She was still framing this as a paperwork problem that would be resolved in her favor, not a fundamental misunderstanding of who owned what. I can meet tomorrow. How about 2 p.m. at the mansion? Perfect. We'll get this sorted out quickly. After hanging up, I called Sandra. They want to meet tomorrow at 2 p.m. Are you ready? I think so. What's the play? Simple. Walk in as yourself, same clothes, same demeanor, same quiet Riley they've been manipulating for weeks. Let them present their version of events. Then hand them this. She emailed me a single PDF document titled Property Ownership Clarification, Thornfield Trust.
When they're done explaining why there must be some mistake, give them that document and wait. Don't say anything else, just wait, and watch their faces as they realize what they're reading. Thursday evening, I stood in my small apartment bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror. Tomorrow, the quiet, financially struggling niece they'd been patronizing would walk into their emergency meeting. But the person who walked out would be someone they'd never met before, someone with the power to determine their entire family's financial future. The irony wasn't lost on me.
They'd spent weeks trying to control my housing situation, my employment, my social connections. Tomorrow, they'd discovered that I controlled their development project, their business plans, and quite possibly their ability to pay for the renovations they'd been so eagerly planning. But the most beautiful part of Theodore's design wasn't the money or the power, it was the choice he'd given me. I could devastate them completely, or I could offer them a path forward that honored what family should actually mean. Theodore had been right about something else, too. The family had convicted themselves with their own behavior. Every manipulation attempt, every dismissive comment, every calculated move to isolate and control me had been documented. Not by me, but by their own words and actions recorded by security systems they'd forgotten existed. Tomorrow, when I handed them that ownership document, they wouldn't just be learning about my inheritance, they'd be discovering that their own schemes had been thoroughly documented and could be used as evidence of attempted fraud if they chose to contest the facts. I went to bed early that night, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be completely rested for what might be the most important conversation of my life. 23 years of being underestimated were about to end. The quiet girl who listened more than she spoke was finally ready to have the floor. I arrived at the mansion at exactly 2 p.m., dressed in the same modest clothes I'd worn to the will reading, same quiet demeanor, same unassuming presence. The family was assembled in the living room like a war council, with legal documents spread across the coffee table and their faces wearing expressions of barely controlled frustration. "Riley, thank goodness," Constance stood immediately, her smile tight with stress. "We need to get this property situation resolved today." "Of course," I said, settling into the same chair I'd occupied during my humiliating dismissal just weeks earlier. "What seems to be the problem?" Preston leaned forward, consulting a legal pad covered in notes. "The county is claiming there's some issue with our ownership of the property. They're saying you have some kind of claim, which obviously doesn't make sense." "Obviously," I agreed mildly. Garrett produced a thick folder from his briefcase. "We've pulled all the relevant documentation. The will, the property deeds, Theodore's business records. Everything clearly shows the family inherited the estate, including all real property." "May I see?" I asked. They exchanged glances, probably thinking this would be the fastest way to demonstrate my lack of standing. Garrett slid the folder across the table. Inside were exactly the documents I expected. Copies of the fabricated will, property records showing Theodore's ownership up until his death, and business filings for the small machine shop the family believed represented his entire commercial enterprise. "This all looks correct," I said, closing the folder. "So you'll contact the county and clarify that there's been some administrative error?" "Well, there has been an error, but probably not the kind you're thinking of." I reached into my purse and pulled out the document Sandra had prepared, a single sheet of paper that would redefine everything they thought they knew about their situation. "What's that?" Constance asked, her voice suddenly wary. I placed the document on the coffee table, centered it carefully, and slid it toward them. "Property ownership clarification, Thornfield Trust." Preston picked it up first, his eyes scanning the page. I watched his expression change from confidence to confusion to something approaching panic. "This says," he started, then stopped, reading again. "What does it say?" Garrett demanded, reaching for the paper. "It says Riley owns the property. All of it. Not just the house, but everything. The entire 100-acre estate." "That's impossible," Constance said flatly. "We just read Theodore's will. We were here when the lawyer explained everything." "You read a will. You weren't present when Theodore's primary estate attorney filed the documents that actually matter." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when people's reality suddenly shifts beneath their feet. I could see them struggling to process information that contradicted everything they'd believed for weeks. "Primary estate attorney?" Jade finally asked. "What are you talking about?
Whitmore handled Theodore's affairs. Mr. Whitmore handled Theodore's family affairs. The $8 million you inherited, this house as you knew it, and some small business interests. Sandra Reeves handled Theodore's actual estate. I reached into my purse again and placed business cards on the table. Sandra's card and my own new card identifying me as Director of Holdings for Thornfield Trust. Sandra Reeves, Garrett read aloud. Corporate estate planning. Who is Sandra Reeves? Theodore's attorney for the past 20 years, the person who helped him structure his real holdings in ways that would protect them from exactly this kind of situation. What kind of situation? Constance demanded. I looked at each of them in turn, these people who dismissed me, manipulated me, and planned to eliminate any evidence that contradicted their version of Theodore's legacy.
The situation where his family would try to cheat his chosen heir out of her inheritance. The words hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one spoke. They were still processing the idea that their assumptions might be fundamentally wrong. Riley, Preston said carefully, I think you might be confused about something. Uncle Theodore left specific instructions about his estate. We were all there when the will was read. You were there when one will was read. Theodore had two wills, Preston. The family will, which left you enough money to feel successful and stop looking deeper, and the real will, which addressed the actual scope of his holdings. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder Sandra had shared with me. Would you like to see Theodore's real financial position? Because I have documentation going back 15 years. The first document I showed them was a corporate filing from 2019, showing Theodore as principal owner of Meridian Holdings with net assets of $47 million. $47 million, Camille whispered. In 2019? That's just one company. There are 42 others. I scrolled through more documents, each one showing a different piece of Theodore's hidden empire. Manufacturing companies, tech investments, real estate holdings, patent portfolios. The numbers kept climbing. This can't be real, Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. Uncle Theodore ran a machine shop. We've seen his books. You've seen the books he wanted you to see. Theodore was very careful about managing family perceptions. I showed them one of my favorite pieces of evidence, a photograph from a family Christmas party 3 years ago, showing Garrett and Constance joking about Theodore's failed business sense while standing in the living room of a house that Theodore had secretly turned into the headquarters of a $100 million investment operation. He was recording us? Constance asked, staring at the photo. He was documenting everything, every dismissive comment, every calculation about how to cut me out of the family, every plan to renovate this house without considering that someone else might own it. I pulled out the security footage transcripts Sandra had prepared for me, page after page of their own words, their own voices, planning to manipulate me while destroying evidence they didn't even know was evidence. This is from last Saturday, I said, finding a particularly damning section. Garrett discussing priority removal items from Theodore's workshop. Items that included filing cabinets full of documents you planned to destroy. We weren't destroying anything important, Garrett protested, just old junk. Old junk that documented $500 million in assets. The number hit them like a physical blow. $500 million. I watched their faces as the math sunk in. They'd been fighting over $8 million, while the real estate was worth more than they could spend in several lifetimes. $500 million, Preston repeated numbly. Current estimated value, yes. Theodore spent 23 years building it, and he left all of it to me. Why? The question came from Constance, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely vulnerable. Why would he do that? I thought about Theodore's letter, about his explanation of real wealth being what you give rather than what you take, but these people weren't ready for philosophy. They needed facts.
Because I was the only family member who never treated him like an obligation. Because I helped him build parts of it without asking what was in it for me. Because when he needed someone he could trust with his life's work, I was the only person who'd never tried to manipulate him for personal gain. The weight of their own behavior was settling on them now. All those years of dismissive comments, patronizing attitudes, treating Theodore like the eccentric uncle they tolerated rather than respected. All those times they'd made me feel like a charity case while planning to eliminate me from any real inheritance. "So what happens now?" Jade asked quietly. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, looking at each of them one final time as the people who had power over me. "Now, you have a choice. You can accept that Theodore's will was his to write, that his money was his to leave, and that he chose to leave it to someone who understood what he built and why he built it. Or you can spend the next several years in court fighting legal documents that were prepared by experts and reviewed by judges, while your own recorded words are used as evidence of your intent to defraud the rightful heir." Preston started to speak, but I held up my hand. "Before you decide, you should know that the development project you've been planning, the one where you're hoping to turn this property into commercial real estate, has already been approved by the county. Ground breaks in 18 months. The land you thought was worth $2 million will be worth approximately $14 million once development begins." They stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. "The contractors you hired for Monday, they're not renovating a house. They're demolishing structures on what will become the largest mixed-use development in the county's history. Theodore owned the land. Now I own the land. Your construction company filed the development permits, Garrett. You've been planning to build on property you never owned." I gathered my documents, placed them back in my purse, and walked toward the door. "You have until Monday to decide how you want to handle this situation. You can work with me to find a solution that honors Theodore's memory and treats everyone fairly. Or you can fight it and discover exactly how thoroughly your uncle documented your behavior over the past 20 years.
As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. "Oh, and Constance? That apartment above Garrett's office, the one you wanted me to move into so you could monitor my activities while you destroyed evidence? I bought the building yesterday. Consider that my notice that your lease won't be renewed." I left them sitting in stunned silence in the living room of a house I now owned, surrounded by documents that proved everything they'd believed about their inheritance was wrong. The quiet girl who'd listened and observed for 23 years had finally spoken, and her words had just rewritten their entire future. Monday morning came without the phone calls I'd been expecting. No angry voicemails, no desperate attempts at negotiation, no lawyers threatening to contest everything. Just silence from the Ashford family, which told me more than any conversation could have. They were consulting attorneys, trying to find angles, looking for ways to challenge what they'd learned. But Sandra had been right about Theodore's preparation. Every document was bulletproof, every structure legally sound, and every prediction about their behavior documented with timestamps and witnesses. I spent that Monday morning in a different kind of meeting entirely. The boardroom at Aurora Technologies, where I was being introduced to the research team behind Theodore's battery storage patents. These weren't theoretical investments or paper companies. These were real people doing real work that was changing entire industries. "Your uncle believed clean energy storage was the key to everything," Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead researcher, explained as she walked me through their current projects. Not just electric cars, but grid storage, residential systems, even spacecraft applications. Theodore hadn't just been hiding money, he'd been quietly funding the future. "The automotive contracts alone generate about $12 million annually," Dr. Chen continued. "But the residential market is exploding. We're looking at potentially tripling revenue within 2 years." Tripling revenue. I was learning that Theodore's legacy wasn't just about accumulated wealth, but about ongoing creation of value, jobs, innovation. The quiet man who tinkered in his basement workshop had been supporting research that would outlive us all.
That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery for the first time since Theodore's funeral. I needed to tell him what had happened, even though I suspected he'd already known how it would unfold. His grave was simple, understated, exactly what he would have wanted. I sat on the grass beside the headstone and pulled out the letter he'd left me, reading it again in the place where he was resting. Build something worthy of your father's memory. I'd been thinking about that phrase for days. My father had died when I was 15, before I'd really understood what kind of man he was, what dreams he'd had beyond just being my dad. But through Theodore's documentation, I'd learned that my father had been Theodore's business partner in those early days, that they had planned to build something lasting together. The money I'd inherited wasn't just Theodore's, it was the continuation of a partnership that had been cut short by tragedy. Theodore had spent 23 years keeping that partnership alive, building toward a future where I could carry forward what both men had started. I know what I want to do with it, I said aloud, feeling only slightly self-conscious about talking to a headstone. I'm going to do what you would have done. 2 weeks later, I was back at the mansion for a very different kind of meeting. The family had requested a sit-down through their attorney, who had spent the intervening time reviewing Sandra's documentation and explaining to his clients why challenging Theodore's will would be financially catastrophic for everyone involved. This time, when I walked into the living room, the dynamic was completely different. No one rushed to greet me. No one offered coffee or tried to manage the conversation. They sat quietly, waiting for me to speak, because they'd finally understood who actually had decision-making power in the room. I've been thinking about Theodore's intentions, I began, settling into what I now knew was technically my own furniture. Constance looked older than she had 2 weeks ago, worn down by whatever conversations she'd been having with lawyers about the impossibility of their situation. He could have cut you out entirely, left you with nothing, made sure you knew you'd been disinherited for your behavior over the years, but he didn't do that. Preston shifted uncomfortably. What are you saying? I'm saying he left you enough to live comfortably, to maintain dignity, to have security. $8 million isn't pocket change, even split 4 ways. He gave you what you needed, not what you wanted. And, Garrett asked warily, and I'm going to honor that intention. You'll keep the $8 million, keep this house as a family property, keep your lives essentially unchanged, but you'll do it understanding that Theodore's real legacy belongs to someone else. I could see relief flickering across their faces, tentative and uncertain. However, I continued, there are conditions. The relief faded. The development project moves forward, but as a partnership. Your construction company can bid for the contracts like any other firm, but you'll compete fairly against other qualified bidders. If you win the work, you earn it. Garrett nodded slowly. It was more than he had any right to expect. The renovation of this house happens according to Theodore's actual wishes, which are documented in files you've never seen. He wanted it preserved as a family gathering place, not transformed into whatever you had planned.
What about the basement workshop? Jade asked quietly. Stays exactly as it is. It's going to become a memorial workspace where local inventors and entrepreneurs can access tools and guidance. Theodore always believed in supporting people who were building things. I stood up, smoothing my skirt in a gesture that had become habitual during these family confrontations. I'm not interested in punishing you for underestimating me or for planning to cut me out. But I'm also not interested in pretending that your behavior over the past month was acceptable. You'll live with the choices you made, and I'll live with the responsibilities Theodore left me. Constance finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. What responsibilities? Creating jobs, supporting research, taking care of people who can't take care of themselves, using wealth to build more wealth that serves more people. I paused,
looking around the room where I'd been dismissed just weeks ago. Everything Theodore taught me about what money is actually for. As I walked toward the door, Preston called after me. "Riley, are we still family?" I turned back. Considering the question carefully, these people had treated me like an obligation for most of my life, had planned to eliminate me from Theodore's legacy entirely, had manipulated and dismissed me when they thought I was powerless. But they were also Theodore's family. And Theodore had chosen to leave them something, even knowing who they were and what they would try to do. "We're still family," I said finally, "but family means something different now. It means you understand that I'm not the grateful niece who needs your permission anymore. It means I make the big decisions and you respect them. It means we all live up to what Theodore actually wanted from us." 6 months later, I was standing in Theodore's old workshop, now bustling with activity as the Ashford Innovation Lab. Local high school students were working alongside engineering consultants, building prototypes and testing ideas. Dr. Chen had moved part of her battery research team to the facility, creating a pipeline between pure research and practical application. The development project was ahead of schedule, with Garrett's construction company having won 2 of the 5 major contracts through competitive bidding. The new mixed-use complex would include affordable housing, commercial space for local businesses, and the county's first public innovation center. Preston had enrolled in business classes at the community college, apparently deciding it was time to learn skills beyond manipulation and assumption. Jade had started a blog about sustainable development that was gaining regional attention. Even Constance had found purpose, organizing a preservation society dedicated to maintaining the historical integrity of properties like Theodore's mansion. They'd all found ways to grow into better versions of themselves once they stopped spending energy trying to control outcomes they never actually had power over. But the most satisfying change was in myself. The quiet girl who'd learned to survive by listening and observing had grown into someone who spoke with authority earned through patience and preparation. I no longer needed to prove my worth to anyone or justify my place in any room. That evening, I was reviewing quarterly reports from Aurora Technologies when my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Miss Ashford, this is Detective Maria Santos with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. We've received information about potential estate fraud involving the Theodore Ashford inheritance. Would you be available for a brief conversation this week?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then smiled and typed back, "Detective Santos, I'd be happy to discuss Theodore's estate with you. I have extensive documentation that might be helpful to your investigation." Someone had reported the family to the authorities, probably hoping to cause problems for my inheritance. What they didn't realize was that I had 15 years of recorded evidence showing exactly who was planning to defraud whom. Theodore was right about one final thing. The guilty really do convict themselves if you give them enough rope. I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of wine, and stepped onto the balcony of my new downtown apartment. The view stretched across the city toward the mountains, encompassing neighborhoods where Aurora Technologies was creating jobs, development projects that would house families, and innovation labs where the next generation was learning to build the future. This was what $500 million looked like when it was used properly, not as a weapon or a shield, but as a tool for creating something larger than yourself. Have you ever discovered that the person everyone underestimated was actually the most powerful person in the room? Have you ever seen someone's patience and preparation completely rewrite what everyone thought they knew about a situation? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear about the quiet observers in your life who turned out to be the ones who really understood what was happening all along. Because sometimes the most dangerous person at the table is the one who's been listening carefully while everyone else was talking. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass them up. Just click and check them out.